make it any clearer that you don't care about people of colour.
The institutional racism in the Labour Party has erupted like a volcano.
This is Islamophobic, racist language that was said by a then member of our cabinet and printed in a national newspaper.
Fact of the matter is the media don't like black and brown women.
And I remember when Rishi Sunak came into power and there were so many people that were like, oh, isn't it great to have this representation? It's like, no, this isn't a TV show.
Hello and welcome to Media Storm. We're back in the studio and it is once again guest host Coco Khan. Hi Coco.
Hello everyone, it's me, Coco, I'm back.
She can't stay away. So it's Pride Month. Oh my God, happy June. It's Pride Month. It's a time dedicated to uplifting LGBTQ plus voices, to celebrating queer culture, to supporting LGBTQ plus rights. How have the Tories decided to mark Pride Month, Coco?
Exactly as we expected, by taking your rights away. Happy Pride Month. Let's roll back to the 70s. So the Conservatives have promised to rewrite the Equality Act so that protections it enshrines on the basis of a person's sex apply only to their biological sex.
Right, so Kemi Badenoch, the Women's and Equalities Minister, said the new law would allow organisations to bar transgender women from single-sex spaces, including hospital wards and sports events.
In classic Conservative style, they don't explain how this would actually make things better for really anyone, even if they are marginalising and harming an already vulnerable group. You know, if apparently that is good for someone else, well, they don't necessarily explain how that is. And they couldn't even be drawn on the question, which is, will we have to bring our birth certificates to toilets? So that's really telling you something. But let's hear from the experts. Mermaids, the charity that supports transgender, non-binary and gender diverse young people, said in a statement that the Equality Act is world-class legislation that took almost a decade to develop and has been working well for 14 years. Under the Act, trans people can legally access single-sex services based on their gender, and services can exclude trans people whether or not they hold a gender recognition certificate if it is a proportionate thing to do to achieve a legitimate aim. It is not necessary to redefine sex in the Equality Act for service providers to provide a range of services. This is something they routinely do already.
I mean, I was scrolling online when this happened, which probably isn't the best place to scroll when, you know, it comes to trans rights. But I was scrolling on Twitter and I found it very interesting how it's so quickly changed from we need to protect biological sex, we need women-only spaces, to we should just scrap the Equality Act altogether.
Yeah.
It so quickly gets so extreme.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, like, it's impossible to understand how they would implement it, how it would be carried out. You know, for clarity, obviously totally against it, but also just in general, I'm like, what on earth are you banging on about? Where has this come from? Well, we know where it's come from, actually.
Right, so I was going to ask, is this just a culture war? Are we calling it what it is? Is this just them leaning into culture war pre-election?
That's my personal belief, you know. I think that it is politically expedient for them and it's working well for them, not least because they don't actually have any policies or anything else to say, than to just hit the hate button. Like, it's low-hanging fruit for them. Do you know what I mean? Just hit that hate button, you'll get them clicks, you'll get that Daily Mail support, and I think that's what they're looking for.
I also found it quite funny that the headline was Tories pledged, so Kemi Badenoch had said, you know, we're going to clear up all this confusion over the legal definition of sex. And I was kind of thinking, is there confusion or are you just creating the confusion? Because I wasn't confused until you came on and said that you're clearing up the confusion.
Well, I mean, we did an episode about, but it was particularly about like trans healthcare in the wake of the CAS review. And I was chatting to Freddie McConnell, who's a journalist and writes about these issues. And he was saying that, because I offered to Freddie that in a way, all this conversation has been magicked out of thin air, that, you know, processes have been in place for a really long time and have been working effectively. There didn't really seem to be lots of examples of it going terribly wrong or anything like that. Most people were getting by. They weren't even really thinking about it until the reform was proposed to sort of make it a little bit easier. It's sort of administrative change. But he pushed back on me on that, and he was like, well, actually, no, there were things that were going wrong for trans people particularly, and actually it wasn't working well for them at all, and the process already was very dehumanising. And so, maybe if you were being generous, you might say there was some review of this needed. But unfortunately, the people doing the review had already made up their minds. And you can't trust that they were going into it in good faith, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't just election pledges based on demonising the trans community. The final act of government before Parliament dissolved pre-election was the passing of emergency legislation to ban private prescriptions for puberty blockers to treat under 18s. So in the final minutes of the last Parliament, the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, introduced new rules, and these rules would be effective for 3 months.
The government argued the laws were necessary to address risks to patient safety. Before this intervention, private clinics could prescribe puberty blockers, even though they are no longer available on the NHS in England, unless children are participating in a research trial. These emergency measures close that loophole. New prescriptions have been paused in Scotland too.
I mean, it just feels mean. Like, it just feels mean, and it just feels like trans voices aren't listened to. There are already horrendously long waiting times for trans people to access healthcare, and in the last minutes of the last scrap of power you have, you're going to focus on 1% of the population.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think as well, one of the things why I feel like all of us should be interested and care and active in our support for the trans community, not just because it's right and moral and ethical and what world we want to live in, but also because, you can see when their rights are being eroded, it will be ours next. And, stuff like using our healthcare system as a political football. What's next? IVF, access to abortion. You can just see it. The writing's on the wall there, isn't it?
Also, what's interesting? Yes, I agree. It's going to come for, you next, but it's already come.
Yes.
Because
yes.
Something that is so underreported in this area is that cis children have been using puberty blockers for years. Puberty blockers have long been used to treat precocious puberty. That's the medical term for early puberty in cisgender children, safely and without any controversy for years. So now they can't access it either.
Goodness me. It's all race to the bottom, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, here on Media Storm, we talk about stories that go underreported. And today I wanted to talk about a big story that didn't seem to make it very far in the mainstream media. An investigation by The Guardian has revealed that Israeli intelligence has spent 9 years interfering with the International Criminal Court, or ICC. Now, this war on the ICC by Israeli intelligence started in January 2015, when it was confirmed that Palestine would join the court after it was recognised as a state by the UN General Assembly. The ICC also launched an investigation into alleged war crimes in Palestinian territories in 2021. And it's been revealed in this investigation that the former head of Israel's Foreign Intelligence Agency allegedly threatened a chief prosecutor of the ICC in a series of secret meetings in which he tried to pressure her into abandoning the war crimes investigation. Okay, this is a huge story, especially given what is happening in Israel and Palestine right now. But it wasn't picked up by mainstream news outlets. A scan that I did yesterday showed us that the places it was reported on were the French paper Le Monde, the New Arab, and the Palestine Chronicle. Why?
I mean, I can't answer the question why. I certainly feel that it's a dereliction of duty. I definitely think that. I think these are really, really important stories that need to get out there. And I think something that I really worry about, and I'm aware I just sound like a naive idiot, but courts working, good. I think that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
And I genuinely am concerned that the basic fabrics of what holds this mess together, certain institutions, rule of law, are being eaten away at. And a story like this that reveals how there's a sort of meddling that goes on behind the scenes, I think is really important, so that we can all club together and say no to this sort of behaviour. Because the only way that any of that is going to stop is if people know about it and stop it, essentially. We can't just rely on the goodwill of states to stop manipulating institutions for their own ends. They're just not going to do that. The only way they can do it is because it operates in darkness. So I think it's a total dereliction of duty from the press, and it really does make me very, very sad.
I completely agree. And I was wondering, was there something, because it was like a Guardian exclusive investigation, was there was there a restriction on other places reporting on it? But it doesn't work like that, does it?
Well, I mean, that in terms of restrictions, I don't know, but definitely something that I've been looking at just in terms of my own journalism work is how basically people don't share, press don't share. It's like a territorial thing and arguably a market thing, right? Like ultimately these companies are private companies, and whilst they have a public good, or they certainly should recognise their public good, they also need to sell papers, own rights to stuff, make money, and to continue going. I actually think about so many scandals that, like, you know, journalists hold individual pieces, but nobody is willing to kind of share them and open up. I don't know if this is the case here. I think, you know, one of the things we're going to talk about in this podcast is all the problems around reporting, deep problems around reporting on what's happening in Israel and Palestine. But definitely, I think there is something to be said about, like, why not just share, guys? Wouldn't that make it easier?
Yeah, definitely. It's all about like, oh, I need to grab that scoop first and I need to and I take ownership over that scoop. And then meanwhile, super important stories are falling through the cracks. Another story we want to talk about, or more specifically, the way this story has been reported on in the media, is the fact that Nigel Farage is standing for election in Clacton days after ruling himself out. And he also said he will become leader of Reform UK, which is the right-wing former Brexit party.
Oh, sorry for the grey.
I know.
I hate talking about this man.
Okay, this is good. I'm glad you've said that. Okay, because we hate talking about this man. So I don't want to talk about this man. I want to talk about how the media has talked about this man.
Yeah.
Okay. Has the media, especially the broadcast media, played a role in promoting Nigel Farage and constantly platforming him without any real scrutiny?
I mean, I think it's undeniable that they played a role. I mean, if you compare like how other leaders from other parties, more mainstream parties, I mean, like, you know, Nigel Farage has never had a seat in Commons. You know, if you look at how much they're interviewed, I mean, it pales in comparison of how much time this guy has. He is very much a darling of the media, and he's arguably a creation of the media. And he's a smooth operator, and he knows that, and that is why he's back, and I am genuinely a bit afraid of him.
Oh my gosh. I mean, last week, Farage was on Question Time, and this is reportedly his 37th time on BBC Question Time. This is despite not being elected and Reform only gaining 2 seats at the recent local elections.
I think as well, you know, when we talk about exposure, of course, that's across all media, but a lot of his media has been TV. And there's this thing as well where TV producers, and I wouldn't like to cast aspersions about TV producers, although I would just mention that when they do a class analysis of people that work in TV, they are predominantly from a certain class, and I'm sure your listeners will know what one. But like, he is considered entertaining. And that is, for me, I feel like that should just be like removed from television news completely. You know, I think, or certainly be downgraded in how important it is. People think, television producer people think he's great crack, or he's like, you know, funny, or he tells it how it is. Obviously, if you're like black or brown, you just watch him and you like break out into hives. So we have a different perspective maybe. But, you know, and I think that's also factors into some of his exposure, his huge amount of exposure. People think he's good entertainment. He makes for a cracking debate. It's all by people who clearly are not going to be impacted by the policies that he kind of heralds in. And I think as well, you know, when you're looking about the BBC are very scared of the Conservative Party, and so arguably they might feel like when they give voice to people like him, particularly during the Brexit period, that they shore themselves up favour with the Conservatives.
Right.
Even though the Conservatives don't like him because he's a thorn in their side, he has also been a valuable asset to them in terms of creating or certainly promoting issues that they have then jumped on, and then that's been very successful for them. So I think there's quite a lot of things at play. But generally speaking, I've had enough of him, and I hope I never have to see him or mention his name ever again.
I know. Your point about entertainment, him as an entertaining figure, and the media forgetting, like really, really forgetting his harmful policies and his harmful words and the things he has said and the things he has done, and how he spearheaded Brexit and now barely even speaks about it anymore. You know, he did a lot of harm, still continues to do a lot of harm, but it's like, oh, it's so funny because he went on I'm a Celebrity. Like, oh my God. Like, honestly.
Just as an aside, like, Is he that funny? Is he that good? Like, what? Oh, I know that humour and charm is subjective. I get that. But also, I'm like, really? What's so good about him? Just he wears yellow trousers. That's it. That's it. He dresses like he's Toad from Toad Hall. That's it. That's all you need. Wow.
Well, this actually leads us into what we're going to be talking about today, because people like Nigel Farage, usually powerful male figures who are spreading misinformation on the reg, get treated almost like cartoon characters, like silly buffoons, yet they're repeatedly afforded with opportunity after opportunity.
But who doesn't get given the same grace? People of colour, especially women. There's been weeks of confusion over Diane Abbott's future in the Labour Party. And this week, parliamentary candidate Faiza Shaheen resigned from the Labour Party after a shock deselection.
It leads us to ask the questions the media seem to want to avoid. Is there a double standard? Are people of colour under more scrutiny from the public and the media? And are we desensitised to suffering when it comes to brown skin?
Welcome to Media Storm, the podcast that starts with the people who are normally asked last.
I'm Helena Wadia.
And I'm Coco Khan.
This week's Media Storm: media racism, Faiza Shaheen, Palestine coverage, and the limits of representation. Welcome to the Media Storm studio. We are so lucky today to be joined by two very special guests. Our first guest is the director of the anti-racist movement, The Three Hijabis. She's a journalist, writer, and equalities campaigner who was a Labour councillor for 6 years before resigning from the party in October last year. We'll be speaking more on that later, but for now, welcome Shaista Aziz.
Hi there, so lovely to be with you all.
Our second guest is the founder of the UK's leading South Asian culture magazine, Burnt Roti. She is also the founder and co-director of Middlesex Pride, celebrating the unheard LGBTQ+ community in the heavily immigrant Middlesex area. You can also read her debut book, Burning My Roti, which is out now. So welcome to Sharon Dhaliwal, and also my mate. Just for clarity, I feel like it's important to just, in the interest of transparency, Sharon's my mate.
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you.
And also a very jealous person here who wants to be your mate.
Well, you are now.
Yes.
Well, you are. You
We're
always were.
online mates.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Online mates is real mates now, guys.
Yeah.
That's where we're at, 2024.
Okay, well, I'm really excited for this conversation. And the first story that we're going to break down today is about Faiza Shaheen's deselection from the Labour Party. Now, who is Faiza? She's an academic and economist, has worked in the field of addressing economic and social inequality for years. In the 2019 election, Faiza very nearly defeated the Tory candidate Ian Duncan Smith in the area of Chingford and Woodford Green, where she lives and grew up. It was the highest ever vote for Labour in that area.
Faiza was again selected by her local party in 2022 to stand again for Chingford and Woodford Green. But last week, she found out via an email from Labour's NEC, the National Executive Committee, so those are the people who choose candidates, that she'd been deselected. Why? A series of 14 liked tweets from over 10 years.
And we are going to talk very briefly about the tweets, because I personally feel in the mainstream press we haven't accurately heard what these liked tweets actually were. So Faiza liked a colleague's tweet saying that he was running as a Green councillor. This was in 2014, before she had even joined the Labour Party. She retweeted a list of companies to boycott to support Palestine, also in 2014.
Another tweet that was brought up to Faiza as an issue was speaking about her own experience of Islamophobia in the Labour Party. And the like tweet that's probably got the most attention in this is, above an old Jon Stewart sketch from The Daily Show about Israel and Palestine, there was a tweet which made reference to the Israel lobby and how non-stop harassment, that's a quote, non-stop harassment, discourages people from speaking out online due to being, and again a quote, immediately assailed by scores of hysterical people who explain to you why you're completely wrong. In her interview, Faiza apologised for liking the tweet and said she didn't remember doing so.
Now, many people have pointed out that Faiza doesn't have anything to apologise for. After all, every country has dedicated lobbyists. Many people have said that the tweets are a distraction and Faiza's deselection is part of an ongoing purge of the Labour left, which the Labour Party denies. Faiza has since written about what she calls a systematic campaign of racism, Islamophobia and bullying, adding that Keir Starmer's party has a problem with black and brown people. On Tuesday, Faiza announced she resigned from the Labour Party and is deciding her next steps. We may well know her next steps by the time this podcast comes out, but as we're recording, we don't currently know them. Shaista, you were a member of the Labour Party up until quite recently. What do you think is behind Faiza's deselection?
So I think that the institutional racism in the Labour Party has erupted like a volcano. Institutional racism exists all across our society in multiple organisations. It definitely exists in our political system. So for me, what we've been seeing in the last week in particular, but it goes way deeper than that, is a manifestation of this institutional racism. I wrote a piece for The Guardian on Monday, June the 3rd, about not only Faiza's case, but what happens to women of colour and Black women, specifically in our places of work, when we name the problem. And the problem is racism. And we know that racism is not about individuals, it's about a system, and it's about a power and abuse of a system and abuse of power. Now, I resigned from the Labour Party intentionally last year after Keir Starmer's horrific rhetoric around endorsing the collective punishment of Palestinians when he gave an interview on LBC radio. And I made a conscious decision to resign. And I'm really pleased that I did that. I had no option. I've given a lot of my life, dedicated it to the values of the Labour Party, what I thought were the values of the Labour Party. That for me was a red line. And I think what we're seeing now is a red line for lots of other people. So the treatment of Diane Abbott, or the mistreatment, I should say, and the mistreatment of Faiza Shaheen really do speak to the hierarchy of racism that Keir Starmer's Labour Party is overseeing. We've seen the Ford report. An eminent QC investigated racism in the Labour Party. He was commissioned by the Labour Party to do so. And he gave very clear findings where he said that there was a hierarchy of racism in the Labour Party. Namely, he mentioned anti-Blackness and also Islamophobia. Now, of course, the Labour Party needs to eradicate anti-Semitism. We need to eradicate anti-Semitism across society. We also need to eradicate all forms of racism, including Islamophobia and including anti-Black racism. And what the Labour Party is doing is, as I said, they're overseeing a hierarchy of racism where they are not taking racism seriously. And what that basically does then is pit minorities against each other. And what we have seen horrifically since the start of the bombardment of Gaza is a 300% reported cases of Islamophobia. These are reported cases, so these are underreported because we know hate crime is underreported. Disproportionately, it's impacting Muslim women, particularly those who choose to wear a headscarf, a hijab, so women who look like me and indeed other women. We've also seen a massive rise in anti-Semitism. So what the Labour Party is doing really is pretty much sending a message out saying that one form of racism we want to tackle, another form of racism we're going to turn our back on and close our eyes and just pretend it doesn't exist. And this, for me, is what this is about. And I'll just finish up by saying, you mentioned the word distraction. In my piece for The Guardian, I talked about the brilliant Toni Morrison and how she talks about how racism becomes a distraction, particularly for those who don't think they have any skin in the game. And she says the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work and it keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And this has been pretty much what Faiza Shaheen has had to do. You know, the interview she gave on Newsnight was devastating to see a shell-shocked woman of colour, a Muslim woman who's dedicated more than 4 years of her life campaigning in the constituency where she was born and raised, reduced to someone who was so visibly traumatized. And we've seen the same with Diane Abbott. And it's not just these two women, multiple people of colour, including myself and women of colour, have been mistreated in the system of the Labour Party. And that is what I think the Labour Party needs to own and it needs to deal with.
So let me ask you about the media's role in this. Obviously, Media Storm, we'll always like to interrogate the media's role or lack of scrutiny in this area. And one of the arguments for Keir Starmer's very clearly inconsistent treatment is that he's just extremely scared of the press. He's really, really scared of the likes of the Daily Mail and the Sun, and anything that is even, you know, something that they could get a handle on is something that he has to eliminate. And the fact of the matter is the media don't like Black and brown women. Do you think that is a fair assessment of what's going on here?
No. Keir Starmer, in a few weeks' time, is due to become the next Prime Minister of this country. If he doesn't like the media, then he is if he says he doesn't like the media, then basically I think that's very disingenuous. He is courting the media and he's courting media attention to get into power. And in the modern world we live in, that's what you have to do, right? So I think that what's going on with Keir Starmer is that it's really difficult to understand what he actually stands for. I have no idea what he stands for, all the flipping and flopping that's taking place. And on anti-racism, if he is an anti-racist, which he claims he is, and if he does believe in upholding human rights, and he's a former human rights barrister, then he needs to not only talk the talk, he needs to walk the walk as well. And we're not seeing that. And, this is not the first time in political history that women of colour in particular have been used as fodder by politicians to access power. This has gone on throughout history. If we look at recent history, we look at the so-called war on terror. Politicians stood on podiums when they went to bomb Afghanistan, claiming they were doing it to liberate Muslim women, Afghan women. Women of colour, our bodies have been used over hundreds of years, as I said, for propaganda by politicians, but we should not be seeing that now. We live in one of the most diverse, pluralistic countries in the whole of Europe, and increasingly people of colour in particular are taking more and more interest in politics because sadly politicians are not reflecting our community's interests. And so I think what's happening here is Keir Starmer might think that, by introducing a cull of left-wing candidates and high-profile women of colour, that he is playing to a certain gallery. But it is misfiring because this is not the way to behave, and it's certainly not the way to get your message across and to show that you are a serious politician who is serious about governing the country in the interests of everyone.
I mean, yeah, to say the least, it's misfiring. Obviously, ethically, it's abhorrent. In terms of actually good for the Labour Party in 20 years when they've lost all their core support, probably not the best move. But also, this whole election campaign, when we're talking about Labour, we're talking about this. It's a total own goal.
Absolutely. And Sharon, let's bring you in here. So we've seen plenty of examples of MPs who have been allowed to run for Labour this year after they've made and apologised for allegedly racist and anti-Semitic remarks. The thing that maybe they have all in common is that they've got white skin. So, I mean, is it just different for people of colour? Are people of colour under more scrutiny in the public and the media?
Well, yeah, absolutely. It seems so, at least, because all the evidence shows that way. We have, for example, what's his name? I don't remember white people's name that well. Luke Akehurst. There's Luke Akehurst who wore that. Can you swear on this?
Yes.
He wore that T-shirt that said, "I'm literally a Zionist shitlord." And he's fine. There's nothing that's happened to him, no repercussions off the back of it. But then you have women of colour who have all had repercussions for liking a tweet from 2014. So, yeah, there's different standards for different people, obviously. And it's definitely women of colour, people of colour will be treated differently.
The thing that I'm always really interested in is how that sort of creates a context. Because obviously sometimes we talk about like the media and politics separate, but they all feed into each other. So when you analyse all the hatred that Diane Abbott got in that 1 year, forgive me, I've forgotten the year. It might have been 2017 or 2019. I can't remember which one it was. But 50% of all vitriol was directed at her. So then when they analysed her investigations, they also, when there was criticism of her and there was an investigation, a number of the criticisms had been fabricated, were made up. There wasn't actually anything there. And actually those criticisms were almost part of the abuse. So it kind of creates a vortex in which punching these women of colour is acceptable outside of the media space, in their workplace, in their personal life. Everything becomes fair game. I find it really scary, which I suppose is why you do what you do, Sharon, is to sort of create an alternative space for that.
Yeah, create an alternative space for safety, but also to then propel people to move into the mainstream media and take space there as well. Because when I first started writing, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't study it or anything, but I really wanted to get into journalism. I really wanted to start writing books. But I knew that because I experienced it, but every time I'd pitch something that was ethnic, because that's my experience, I would hear back from an editor saying, no one would really be interested in this, or it's not for us. And then I wrote it in Burnt Ruddy and everyone loved it. So I was like, people do want it.
Yeah.
And
but
so,
who's replying to those emails.
Yeah.
It's like, not for us. Love Penelope. Love Theodora. Love Augustine, Clementine, or whatever their fucking names are. You know what I mean? It's always the same set of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
and we'll definitely talk about sort of the way that the media is made up a little bit later on. What I find so interesting, just going back to Faiza, what I find quite interesting about the way that Faiza's deselection has been talked about in the mainstream media is that, first of all, if I was just a reader, a consumer of the mainstream media, and if I was glancing over headlines, I would think that the story is that a Labour candidate has been deselected because she liked anti-Semitic tweets, and there was kind of no other context that was presented unless you read beyond the headlines, which, as we know, not everybody does. The second thing I find really interesting is that last Friday, there was a rally in support of Faiza Shaheen where hundreds of people in her local area in northwest London gathered, and they spoke in support of her. We really didn't see that in the mainstream press. So I know that the PA news agency was there, and they spoke to one supporter, and then snippets of those kind of conversations made it into an article in the Evening Standard and in the Independent. But in terms of what her supporters were saying, what people were fighting for, what they were calling for, their opinions, that was covered maybe a little bit in local media and otherwise just not at all. And I think that says a lot. If you're covering Faiza's deselection, but you're not covering the local support for her, what narrative are you putting out in the mainstream?
It's not clickbaity enough, is it? To then say, you know, she has support. You know, what's clickbaity is, you know, she liked anti-Semitic tweets. And so that's what people are going to click on. That's what people are going to read. Because it's all about, you know, getting the readers. It's getting the numbers. You know, it's not about telling the actual story, is it?
Yeah, it's also about stereotyping people, isn't it? So there's an automatic assumption that let's just name this for what it is. If you're a Muslim, for example, and obviously we're not all the same, who knew that? But, you know, you're automatically a homophobe. You're automatically an anti-Semite. Now, I'm not sitting here telling you that there aren't Muslims who are not homophobes, who are not anti-Semites. But what I'm saying is there's an automatic assumption that you are one. And it's a given that because of the way you dress or what you believe in or whatever, that is what you purport to believe in. So I think this is all part of that story as well. And, you know, the stereotyping, the tropes around people of colour and communities. And when we use the word community, overwhelmingly, it means non-white people. We need to call that out for what it is. However, communities are all people. We all live in communities, right? With different walks of life, different people from different walks of life and different backgrounds, and long may that continue. And I think part of the challenge around the narratives around Faiza Shaheen is she does not fit any of the stereotypes. And thankfully, neither do any of you, or neither do most of us, right? And the media simply cannot get its head around that. And it is quite an embarrassment, actually, to see some of the coverage and the kind of angles and the kind of insinuations around, you know, her so-called support of anti-Semitism. It's really woeful and shameful. And what it does is it further challenges those of us who do fight against anti-Semitism and those of us who fight against all forms of racism. And overwhelmingly, what we know is that where you find anti-Semitism, you usually find Islamophobia. They are more often than not different faces of the same coin, especially when it comes to politics, right? You know, if you look at Europe, there's the EU elections are taking place. The amount of trash that we're hearing around Muslims, migration, you know, the far right on the march. They're no friends of Jewish people. They're no friends of Muslims. They're no friends of anyone apart from their small constituency of people who share the same views as them. That doesn't come across in any of this coverage, which is also dangerous and disingenuous.
I suppose and I completely agree with your assessment and everything you've said. And I think that's why that Newsnight interview was so powerful, because it also, if for anyone that read it and read this stereotype, they see a Muslim sounding name. They don't know anything about Faiza's opinions. They know nothing about her except she's got a brown face and a Muslim name. That's all they know. And they jump to that conclusion, and then they see her on the screen. And what you see is someone who is not this one note, you know, cardboard, two-dimensional character that's been drawn in a racist cartoon, but a mother, a human, a person, someone you get on with, someone you'd have a cup of tea with, but actually you don't get the opportunities to show your humanity. I think that's a thing I think that's worth being said.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're talking about the dehumanization of brown people, you know, the next topic that we have to talk about, although some media outlets seem to just not want to talk about it at all, is Palestine. And I mean, yeah, if we're talking about these things, we have to talk about Palestine. We have seen some of the most horrendous, shocking, disgusting acts of violence against the people of Palestine before October 7th, and certainly since after October 7th, Oxfam say the daily death rate in Gaza is higher than any other major 21st century conflict.
Over 36,000 Palestinians have been killed since last October. Those numbers are absolutely horrific. Thousands remain unaccounted for. The number of children killed is higher than from 4 years of world conflict. Nearly all children in Gaza are at risk of famine. I mean, yeah, you see these numbers written out like this and you wonder like why we aren't all just downing tools right now and doing something about it. And I guess the question you ask is, are we desensitized?
I mean, I think we are. I think we definitely are. I mean, we look at images of poverty porn from charities. It's always, you know, non-white people who are sick or who are in need. And they always are. It's saying that non-white people are always in need, you know. And so we've seen these images on the tube, on the TV, like forever. I can remember them from when I was a little child. And so when you see it now, it feels like you've seen it before. It doesn't feel, you do become desensitized. And then like you see the difference with, for example, Ukraine, you know, when you saw those images and you saw the reactions that the media had to it, that, you know, the government had to it, very different. It was very different. And it's because it's not something we're used to.
No, you're right. It's become normalized to see like the Middle East in rubble. It's become normalized to see brown people suffering. And so people think that that's just all it is.
It also really feeds into what we were talking about before, which is about Islamophobia, the mainstreaming of racism in our political systems. And I'm a former international aid worker. I spent more than 15 years working across the world. I've been very privileged to, you know, have the most incredible access to people. I worked extensively across the Middle East, including Gaza and including the West Bank. And I'm also a journalist. And I can tell you the first time I set foot in the occupied West Bank, I was absolutely stunned because I thought I had an idea of what was going on in the world as a journalist and someone who, you know, really lives and breathes current affairs and news. I had no idea what was going on because mainstream UK news does not tell you a truthful story, a nuanced story about what is happening to people. So honestly, it was the first time in my life that I understood what a checkpoint really is about, which is about mass humiliation and obviously stopping people from moving around. But it is really a space where violation of human beings takes place all the time. And you know, there was a study out a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, by Glasgow University that showed that people who consume mainstream news, when you talk to them about the so-called, they call it the conflict, Israel and Palestine, is the occupation, the longest running military occupation in the world. People don't know what's going on because of the way this story is told. They're confused. They genuinely are scratching their heads trying to work out what's going on. I have to say, horrifically, all of that has changed in the last 8 months of the genocide unfolding in Gaza, because for the first time, Palestinians are telling their stories and they are filming everything because Western journalists can't get access to Gaza either. And we know that the highest number of journalists have been killed in Gaza compared to any other conflict in recent times. Fellow journalists are unwilling to really show full solidarity to journalists themselves, which is also problematic. But I think the reason why this narrative is changing is because, like I said, the filtering of hearing the voice of the average Palestinian compared to their so-called political representatives is so far removed. And it's the first time that we're actually hearing and seeing and understanding what's going on. And this is why there is the level of outrage that we're seeing, and not only in terms of protests in the streets, which have been horrifyingly labeled as hate marches and other disgusting labels attached to decent people calling out what's going on, but also the reason why we have the rise of the independent candidate, for example, in this election, and why so many people are saying, well, we can't really vote for either the current government that wants to get back in or the leader of the opposition and his party, because we don't see that much difference. In fact, before I came on to have this conversation with you, I saw a clip circulating on social media where Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, is somewhere in the northeast of England, and a group of white people who used to vote for Labour have confronted her about Palestine. And again, the media distortion is that only people who look like me, or brown women who look like you, are challenging what's going on.
Yes.
They're not. There's massive numbers of people who are absolutely horrified by what they're seeing. And yes, we're horrified by what we're seeing in Sudan and what we're seeing in other parts of the world. And we have to understand that specifically on Palestine and Gaza, this country has a deep colonial legacy attached to it. And we have, we sell arms, we veto things when it comes to the UN Security Council, and we've given carte blanche to what has been going on in Israel in the name of Israel having the right to defend itself, which it does. However, it needs to be done under international law, and that is not what we are seeing right now.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because it's always been a personal bugbear of mine how people try to categorize support for a ceasefire as being like a concern for minorities, when actually this is a mainstream concern. And even if it was a concern for minorities, it doesn't mean that should be immediately disregarded anyway. But nonetheless, lots and lots of people care about this across ages, across classes. It's the big moral question of our time, and it's, I'm really glad to hear you say that.
And it's exposing all the racism and all the systemic racism as well, isn't it? I just want to share this really quick story with you guys. When I resigned, I got my hard hat hijab on, ready for, what was going to come, i.e. racism and Islamophobia. Touch wood, it didn't come. And one of the first members of the public who commented to me was when I was out in the supermarket, and an old gentleman stopped me and he had to say about Palestine. He told me that he had family members who were in the kibbutz that was attacked, and then he started crying, and then I found myself crying, and then his wife joined us, and the three strangers crying with each other, absolutely devastated at the loss of human life in the kibbutz in Israel. I've got goosebumps as I'm telling you this, and also what is being done to the Palestinians. And it is really not hard to be a human being and to believe that everyone's life matters. It really isn't. And the tragedy is that the divisiveness of our politicians means that we are all being attempts to shunt us into one corner or the other, right? If you believe in the life of Palestinians, then you must believe in Hamas. If you believe in X, you must believe in Y. It's absolutely shocking. And all decent-minded people, anywhere, whatever they look like, whatever they believe in, are utterly horrified by what's going on. It's having a profound impact on our communities here, Muslim communities, Jewish communities, all communities. And I really urge all of us to stick together on this and to find ways to have these challenging conversations, and to understand that if you believe that a Palestinian baby's life matters, then you must believe that a Jewish baby's life matters, and vice versa. And if you don't, then you need to go and have a word with yourself.
Yeah. Actually, I think we had a real life example of this. The politicians stand on Palestine in last night's TV debate. So we're recording this on Wednesday. The ITV debate between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer was on last night. And there was a question from the audience member about the awful scenes in Gaza. And then it was immediately picked up by the moderator, the ITV moderator, and put back towards the two leaders of the parties. And kind of like reframed by the moderator as about the Hamas terrorist atrocities of 7th of October and then what unfolded after. So, listen, as Shaisa, you said as well, the violence against Israeli civilians, that was rightly spoken about. But Israel's violence against Palestine was dumbed down to, and then what unfolded after. Whereas that was what the question was about. I mean, the question was changed and reframed, and the meaning was lost. Do you think that would have happened with a different conflict? I don't know.
I doubt it. But also, I mean, what would their answer be? They have to reframe it for them, because their answer would be like, yeah, we're just letting it happen. And they can't really respond to that. So it has to be reframed as it's Hamas that's attacking, and, or everyone needs to denounce Hamas. That's what it's about now, because...
Yeah. And it's, there's a nation state called Israel, and there is an armed group called Hamas, which is designated a terrorist group by the UK and the US and many other countries as well. A nation state has to abide by laws and rules, which it's not abiding by in any shape, way or form. And obviously specific rules apply to nation states, and specific rules also apply to armed actors and terrorist groups they also have to abide by the Geneva Conventions, which clearly they haven't in relation to taking hostages from inside Israel. However, we need to be really blunt here. A nation state should be held to a different level of standards. And there are plenty of people who claim that if you hold Israel to account, you are being anti-Semitic. This is a disgrace. Israel needs to be held to account, not only for what it is doing currently in Gaza, but for the occupation, which has been going on for more than 75 years. It's the longest running military occupation in the world. And whenever people like me pop up, or maybe any of you, to talk about this, as soon as we start saying, well, this didn't start on October the 7th, there's an attempt to squash and shut us down. And again, people are not falling for this anymore, because more and more people are listening and hearing the lived experiences of Palestinian people. And they are also going through the records and looking at human rights organizations like Amnesty International, who I worked for many years ago, and other organizations that have been documenting and cataloging horrific human rights violations, which have been going on and on and on. And I don't think there's any other situation in the world where this context, there'd be an attempt to shut this context down. This context is really important. And let's not pretend otherwise. Britain is responsible for the Balfour Declaration. It was written by British men. They handed over the state of Palestine because people in this country who are running this country didn't want Jewish people here. Anti-Semitism is at the roots of how this has started. And so is, the hatred of Arabs. These two hatreds have created what we currently have. And I wish, my long-lasting wish, obviously, other than wanting to see an end to what is going on in Gaza and for the hostages to be released, I want to see peace. But you cannot have justice. You cannot have peace without justice. Peace can only come about through justice and through liberation. And I think that with Keir Starmer now looking to get into number 10, the Labour Party is going to have to up its understanding of what is going on. And also this Orientalist kind of categorization of the Middle East. We are talking about a military occupation that's gone on for 75 years. Let's call it what it is.
Yeah, they're definitely not great at using the correct terminology. You spoke about the lived experience of Palestinians, which has definitely been sorely lacking in the media. In February, at the George Polk Awards for Journalism, the award for foreign reporting went to the staff of the New York Times for unsurpassed coverage of the war between Israel and Hamas. Last month, the New York Times again was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting for exposing the horrors Hamas inflicted on Israel on October the 7th and the devastating toll of Israel's assault on Gaza.
To say, as they did in 2021 for reporters in Afghanistan and again in 2022 for journalists in Ukraine, that the Pulitzer Board honoured media workers in Gaza with a special citation.
But even putting aside if the New York Times coverage was good or accurate, what does it tell us that these awards were not given to the Palestinian journalists actually reporting in and from Gaza?
Well, it shows that, the journalists aren't put to a higher standard. They're just saying that these are like all the other Palestinians that we don't care about. And so why would they award them, really? And they're doing so much work. Everything that we know about what's happening in Gaza right now is from them. We're not learning anything from mainstream media at all. I mean, I sat down with my dad recently, and he has social media, but he doesn't really understand it. So he doesn't know what he's looking at, and he watches the news. And so everything he knows about what's happening is from BBC or it's from Sky News. And I sat down with him and had a conversation, and it was about 2 hours later that we kind of came to an understanding that he should stop doing that and just have conversations with people instead. But he truly, truly believed that Hamas were basically out to get the world, and Israel were in their right, to fight back, because that's all he saw and that's all he believed until he was given another perspective. And he went, oh, right, okay, hold on, that's not right. And he didn't know the history either. And he doesn't have access to see all these people on the ground. He doesn't have Instagram. He doesn't have Twitter, and so he doesn't see it. And I think that's the issue as well. We have a lot of generations that don't know what's happening. A lot of older generations.
Definitely.
And I think that question also speaks to the heart of the problem with the media. I am a journalist, you know, obviously I'm freelance now if anyone wants to commission me. But before that, I was at The Guardian. And like, look, you know, The Guardian has its problems. No one's denying that. I think they wouldn't deny it either. But it does try its best in a difficult landscape. And one of the problems is that, like, essentially the agenda is being driven by everybody else. So I'll give you an example, you know. When the boat crossing started, I remember being in the office, and obviously the way the right-wing press, I'm thinking particularly of The Sun, talked about it was like horrific, dehumanizing, disgusting language. And so obviously the journalists set to work to debunk what they were saying and to sort of say, no, that's wrong, that's wrong. But in the meantime, no one's making the conversation about safe routes because you're so busy just trying to like bat away all of that sort of stuff. You don't get the time to articulate. That's not to make excuses for the people, the journalists that do a bad job in giving that context, which is necessary, particularly, you know, when we're looking at what's going on right now. But I sometimes go, I'm like, oh my God, like it is such a, feels sometimes like an insurmountable obstacle, which is just the fact that like progressive voices are super up against it because of a client journalist landscape, billionaire backers owning the media, horrible internet disinformation farms. It's just, it feels
24-hour news
just
cycle
all the time.
Yeah.
It's really challenging.
WhatsApp misinformation.
Yeah.
I mean, we know from our immigrant communities and
Yeah.
stuff, like everything's just forwarded from WhatsApp.
They love
And it's
WhatsApp.
oh God, they love it. They have their groups. They have like 50 groups each. But like WhatsApp tried to change that by saying every time you forwarded something, it'd say forwarded 5 times or forwarded many times. So people would be like, oh, maybe this is misinformation. But they don't understand what that means. And also they don't care.
No, I mean,
At all.
yeah. My nan's like just got the ability to do all the forwarding. She doesn't care how many times it's been forwarded.
No.
Yeah,
But I also
no.
think this really speaks about how, you know, when I resigned from the Labour Party, again, I wrote a piece for The Guardian, seems to be something that I've been doing of late on Gaza and politics. And my point was that a group of elders in the city where I was born and raised, Oxford, they came up to me and said, thank you so much for resigning because you're standing up for Palestinians and you're standing up for us. Because when people are smeared, you know, if a group of people, particularly Muslim men, are only ever talked about as child sexual exploiters, groomers in the mainstream media and by politicians who have the same colour skin as them, thank you, Suella Braverman, you know, they understand how these stories about people trying to cross the channel in a boat, how these stories of smearing them and dehumanizing them, they understand how they come about because they have an experience of the same, even though they're not living that reality, right? And on the New York Times stuff that we've been talking about, I think, and also the conversations that you've been having